of relationships that we know can help them succeed. So I wanted to know why is that so difficult? That's one of the questions that I've been pursuing. And one of the things I notice is that there's not necessarily a consensus on the role of schools and education in society. And we see this in K through 12. We see it on campus. Right. And to simplify things for a quick webinar, and we can dig in later if this is interesting and useful. Broadly speaking, education has been asked to meet two large and different, but certainly not competing goals, right? One of them is to train a workforce, right? To develop a workforce and help people get jobs and gainful employment, which is an increasingly critical need for a lot of different reasons in an era of course, pandemic, but also growing economic inequality before that. The other is to develop humans, right? A humanistic, much broader approach, preparing us for life, preparing us particularly in a democracy for citizenship. Right? And so that lack of consensus really, at least in the US, maybe you're listening in from another country where there's more consensus, but at least in the US, there is not necessarily that consensus, right? And so that creates a real difficulty in these kinds of programs, particularly when the people developing the policies and laws related to what schools need to do, a shockingly few amount of them have actually have been classroom teachers. Okay. So a little more context for the study. Why interfaith? Well, this was just me looking at the particular situation of Broward County, which, for those of you who may not know, is in South Florida, in Southern Florida, an incredibly diverse area, right? You name it, we've got people here from that area. We've got we've got indigenous people who've been here for thousands of years, and just every race, color, creed, dozens of languages spoken by the teachers and students, certainly at throughout Broward schools, which I should say was not one of the school systems where I ever taught in middle and high school. I taught up in Virginia, but there were some very similar school systems that had, very similar kind of opportunities, of a lot of richness of diversity, which we'll see is an incredible educational opportunity that has everything to do with building not just peaceful cultures in a school, but in that school's broader community. Right. Well, one of the conflicts that was occurring as I partnered with BCPS was related to interfaith, right? In the 9/11 era, students who were Muslim, or sort of suspected to be Muslim, if you will, or immigrant students could be particular targets, right? After the election of 2016, when now outgoing President Trump was elected, immigrants became a very particular target, as well as Muslims. But they've always been targeted in some ways, even far prior to 2016. So that was one of the reasons that I decided to focus on interfaith. There had been a lot of work on reducing violence just peer-to-peer that BCPS had done. They'd done a lot of really excellent work related to LGBTQ dignity and human rights. But they wanted to explore, based on what the people who I was partnering with told me, they wanted to explore interfaith. So that was why we focused there. Another bit of context that I think is helpful is the widespread failure that I've observed. And you'll see in the data that I present in a little bit that there's that the kids observed the exact same thing. These were high schoolers. Is that when we think of bullying, I'd be so curious. I wish we could interact more, because I suspect that when we think about bullying, images like Bart Simpson kind of come to mind, right? Which really is not, it can be some aspects of what bullying is, but it's much broader than that. It's much deeper than that, right? And we really don't understand bullying. We understand it as kind of two kids who are not getting along, right? We fail to understand the deeper socio-cultural origins of bullying. And interventions are often treated as extracurricular, right? Rather than being woven in, we're missing an opportunity here when we don't sort of build um, proactive cultures of peace throughout the school day and into how the school itself operates. So that's a little bit of context. Right, let me check my time here. Okay. um, Now, some of you, and again, I wish we could interact, but maybe I don't know if folks can give me a thumbs up through a webinar or not. I usually don't do the webinar format. I do the classroom format, but maybe you can give me a thumbs up, maybe not. If you have heard of or engaged at all with peace education, there's a whole world of peace education that that I think is just not nearly visible enough. And this is where kind of my research and my practice and my teaching have lived. As the name suggests, just for those of you for whom this might be completely new, maybe you're just joining us out of curiosity. Peace education, exactly like it sounds, is education that is focused on helping young people, and let's face it, some not so young people, develop the skills and values and attitudes to resolve conflicts without violence and to be able to build peaceful relationships in their communities, right? So critical peace education, right? Because of course we know that there can't be peace without justice. Critical peace education looks at the really deep roots of some of these, violent that just seem to keep cropping up, right? It looks at where is there injustice. It looks at imbalances of power, right? Because imbalances of power will often drive conflict. It looks at understanding sources of inequality and oppression. Critical peace education, which again was my framework, also involves participants, which I love. And you can even involve, the high schoolers themselves. Of course, I involved some of our doctoral students, one of whom is actually, going on to write her own dissertation right now, which is very exciting. Participants can be involved in the program design itself. And critical peace education centers marginalized voices. So we were very intentional, as best we could within the restrictions that teachers and principals had, to make sure that we had a diverse group of student participants, and that we were not just necessarily bringing in all of the students who kind of are perpetually involved in these programs. Right. One of the things that can unfortunately happen with peace education is that the students who have that, 4.0 average and they're at all kinds of clubs and they're college bound, teachers feel comfortable kind of releasing them to take, a day off, here or there to participate in these programs. Whereas the students who might be struggling more are much less likely to get these opportunities. Right. So we worked very hard to try to overcome that as best we could. A contribution to the literature. We needed more research in particular. There's a lot of good case studies that are starting to develop, and some excellent research has been happening from a broader perspective of, does peace education work? Does it have an impact in its school or in its community? What seems to work well? I thought that there was not enough specific research yet on, well, what about youth leadership? What about bringing that into the design of your program? Right? Does that help? Does that make the program more effective? Does it make it more sustainable? And finally, I wanted to argue through the voices of these young people who are really, they don't need me. They're going to make this argument themselves, as you'll see in just a minute. Argue through the voices of these young people for mainstreaming peace and human rights education in public schools. So what did we do? We set up, as you can see here in December 2017, this was myself, Darby, Mike, and Tom at Broward County Public Schools here in South Florida. We set up a series of several dialogues with the generous support of the president's Research and Development Fund, which was an internal grant, again, that we were able to get, which was essential to this work. So we facilitated several interfaith, intercultural dialogues throughout December. And then after that, they were hosted at different, we couldn't be in a school, right, because the classrooms are being used. So they were at different Broward County libraries, in fact. And then based on what came out of those dialogues, students developed and designed their own school-based peace projects, right, based on their assessment of what was particular to their school, what was needed on their school site. One of the goals was to attract and encourage youth leadership for peace in their own high schools. We wanted, for example, to introduce them to basic dialogue skills. What's the difference, for example, between a dialogue and a debate? How do you handle it when someone's really pressing your buttons? How do you overcome some of those cultural gulfs that can sometimes happen? How do you understand the power dynamics in your own school and community? We wanted further to create a space for praxis through these peace projects. Right? So praxis is that sweet spot where theory and action merge. Right? So students, and this really was fairly unique from what I've seen. I can think of some other programs that I've encountered that did this, but not nearly enough of them. Not only were students introduced to these kinds of skills, they were given an opportunity in a very real world way beyond just kind of peer-to-peer mediation to put those skills into place. They weren't just mediating, they were sort of being asked to assess, what does my school culture need and how can I be a part of making that change? So what we did, that we wanted to know, and this was a smaller pilot study. Unfortunately, for a lot of reasons that I can go into, if that's interesting, we haven't yet been able to expand it throughout South Florida the way that I was hoping. But we've still got this pilot study in place as a template. So hope springs eternal, and I am still ready to continue developing this if those opportunities come along. But so the data from this pilot study were really stunning in the impact just this small initial opportunity made on students. We asked them just some brief questions such as, I believe I'm now better able to recognize and prevent bullying, right? You can see for yourself, agree, strongly agree. For those of you who love your stats, our in number was 102. We had 130 students participating. We only were able to get the evaluations back from 102 students for a couple of different reasons. Students could participate in the program, for example, without having to participate in the research aspect of it if they didn't want to. Some of them just forgot, those kind of logistical things. So we ended up with an N of 102. Students who felt like they learned and gained skills, right, such as teamwork, how to help in a bullying situation, understanding diversity, right? You can see that a lot of students, the majority of our students felt that they gained in these skills. We asked students whether or not they thought that their project, and I'll go into a couple details in a minute about what sort of projects the students designed. We asked them whether or not they thought their project would make their school a more inclusive and peaceful place. As you can see, the vast majority of them said that they agreed or strongly agreed, or agreed. In fact, 86%. We learned from our data as well that 93% intended to continue their projects. This was a mixed methods design, right, with some qualitative and some quantitative aspects to it. I just presented some of the evaluative quantitative data, but I thought the qualitative data was just as rich and interesting. What emerged from our data was really a youthful call for peace education. When we asked them whether or not, quote, I think participating in these kinds of projects is important for everyone's education, as you can see, 90% agreed with that they felt these kinds of opportunities are critical for everyone's education. And they lamented, sometimes in no uncertain terms, the lack of opportunity to do so throughout their regular school day. Students who wanted more of these events, 70%, right? A very, very strong majority. We were curious whether or not the students themselves, and of course this is self-reporting, so there is a limitation to that data, but a strong majority felt that their project was successful. Right, nearly all of them felt that they were able to make some kind of impact on their school cultures. Remember, one of the goals of the project was not just to understand peace education a little bit better and to understand why it can be so difficult to sustain these programs. One of the goals of the program was also to develop and inspire this leadership in young people. And one of the reasons that this was is that a lot of these programs, some of them, can tend to overlook or stigmatize young people or not center them, and particularly in a really conflicted environment, right, which some public schools can be. The young people are positioned not as the solution, but as the problem. Right, our research took a very, very different view. And we want to shine a spotlight on what a missed opportunity there is when we overlook the ability of young people to really be leaders in their community. So here's a little bit qualitatively about what students felt that they needed in order to be able to do that. In their eyes, being heard, of course, was essential for student engagement. Quality critical peace education as seen from student eyes addresses the tensions and divisions that exist in the school, which are always going to exist. Quality peace education in student eyes addresses the issues of inequality and social justice, and is relevant to a student's lived experience. Students, based on our data, strongly felt that what we commonly call peace education, what the adults tend to call peace education, ought to be far more centered in their everyday school experience and not relegated to the extracurricular margins. Right? In other words, I came away with the impression from the data and from these young people that what we're calling peace education, they think it should just be called education. Education should itself, broadly speaking, ought to prepare them to impact their communities, grow beyond prejudices, resolve conflict, and problem solve. As this working theory emerged from our themes, which we derived and developed from our qualitative data, we considered this to be our key finding. The first theme that emerged is that students believe being heard is essential for student engagement. Relatedly, they don't think that typical curriculum in a school day allows them this opportunity to talk about their problems, learn about each other. Our program allowed them to feel validated and relevant. Student comments from the qualitative part of our assessment included, everyone got to share viewpoints, and quote, we were able to talk and discuss about different topics such as racism and sexism without being criticized for how we responded. A second theme that emerged, as you can see from the slide here, the short summary on the slide, is that a nurturing, safe environment was what enabled successful dialogues, right? If people, young people, older people, don't feel that they're in a safe space, they're not going to reveal themselves, they're not going to connect, they're not going to be honest or real, which means that issues are not going to get addressed. Students noted that they wanted more diverse and smaller groups and the opportunity to interact with other schools and maybe even other school systems. Despite this feedback, a lot of students felt that the dialogues were welcoming, safe, respectful, open-minded. This allowed students to express their opinions without the fear of discrimination. Right, and a third qualitative theme that emerged, which personally I thought was very, very exciting, was that students viewed sharing experiences and connecting with a diverse group of other people, a diverse group of peers in particular, that in and of itself was a valuable educational experience. The majority of students who participated wanted longer dialogue time. Students enjoyed learning about each other's backgrounds and wanted to invite more peers to participate, perhaps do an actual course integrated into the school day. Not only did students find value in learning about each other's ideas, but also each other's struggles. They expressed that they were heard and accepted despite their differences, and that they felt comfortable being themselves. Students requested for there to be more diversity within the adult leadership. They were very comfortable giving us that feedback, more diversity in viewpoints, and by having more people in general, which we interpreted as peers. As noted before, students felt that they should have more teens from other schools to interact with so that they can learn from other viewpoints. They wanted the opportunity to expand their horizons because they saw a link between that and broader cultures of peace and conflict resolution. Here, I think they exhibited an intuitive, instinctive understanding without ever having taken a single graduate seminar in peace education. Right? They exhibited an intuitive understanding of a key principle of peace ed, which is that education should foster a greater understanding and empathy for the other. Some of the dialogue groups were segregated not only by school, but by race, religion, and class statuses. Right. One of the reasons that this happened, again, is that difficulty that we face in which students end up being allowed to participate in these kind of extracurriculars. Right. People often look at, principals, teachers, guidance counselors often look at disciplinary records, grades, things like that. Unfortunately, class schedules and student availability interfere with a broader selection of participants, which is a puzzle that I am still working on. And I really think integrating things into the school day is one of the best solutions that we have. Venue logistics necessitated this, but it was not ideal. And I was very glad that students sensed that and that this data came up in their evaluations. For the groups that were more mixed, the students enjoyed discussing differences and how those differences impact how we communicate. They were engaged by the exposure to, quote, different points of view and expressed that this ought to be, and I can't emphasize this enough, a central purpose of public education. Connected to all of this with how relevance should shape curriculum, school activities, and pedagogy. Adolescents are at an age when they're willing to discuss political issues, debate current issues, and make a difference, as our participants all noted directly. Students voiced that they wanted to have regular, even weekly opportunities to be able to discuss topics that they experience in their own daily lives. They valued the opportunity to, quote, talk about topics that I was concerned with. One particular student expressed that participating in our dialogues, quote, made me see how the world really is. Clear evidence of learning and educational impact. More critically, however, students also wanted more activities in addition to the dialogue. This finding emerged repeatedly. Students didn't want to just talk about fostering peaceful school cultures. They wanted to engage. While the youth interfaith dialogues, as our above data suggests, are worthwhile on their own, I think the finding of this student desire for action is why we also believe that the opportunities for student-led peace projects were so essential. Otherwise, students might have really experienced a lot of frustration with just talk. All right, so next, we'll take a look at what some of those projects that students designed were. And then I should probably begin wrapping up so we have some time for questions, I'm sure. One of the opportunities or projects that students designed was a screening of Listen, which I don't know if folks are familiar with that. It's a documentary on bullying in school and a school's attempt to create a culture of peace in the wake of the suicide of one of its students. Right, really great documentary. If you want to, I don't know if it's Netflix or where it's landed in in cyberspace. Other students designed, and I thought this was so sophisticated, an inclusive mental health fair. The context always impacts your data. I always have a catch in my throat when I say this. And a couple of my data collection days, I did focus groups with these young people instead of one-on-one interviews because I wanted to hear how they kind of bounced off each other. One of those days that I happened to be collecting data was February 14th, 2018. And I don't know if anybody else recognizes that date, but if you do, then you know that it was the day of the massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High, which, needless to say, incredibly, it impacted us all, but it had a huge impact on Broward County schools for very obvious reasons. And so students brought that with them into their data. So these students wanted to create an inclusive mental health fair, right? They recognize just from their own experience and cultural observation, right, as students who were more culturally marginalized, that not everybody has access to what we call mental health. right? So they wanted to expand it to be more inclusive. They wanted the school to expand their services to be more inclusive and culturally appealing and culturally sensitive. Another group of students did a training for teachers on developing empathy and community. Think about that. Think about how that classroom flipped there, right? And the empowerment of those students actually doing a training for their teachers. And finally, one Muslim youth team led an awareness training. They called it Ask a Muslim Day for their peers and teachers. These were projects that they themselves designed based on their assessment of what was really needed and what would make a difference. So what are some of the implications and lessons here? I started out by wondering and by arguing that there was kind of a gap in an increasingly rich literature on peace education when it comes to evaluating what difference does it make in a peace education program when students are really given an opportunity to lead. Our data showed that youth leadership seemed to increase, pardon me, peer engagement and program impact, as well as sustainability, right? Students could continue these programs beyond the life of our grant. The grant cycle is another problem here. Usually they're only 12 months. That's a whole other study. But we can get into that too if that's interesting and useful. Another important implication here is that the relegation of peace education to being extracurricular remains, I think, and I think our data supports this, the most entrenched issue that HRE, human rights education, and peace education programs face. Our data really showed the value of small teams and long-term engagement over time. Right? December through May, we would have liked longer if we could get it. But at least they had that semester to be able to develop programs. It was critical that students had the opportunity to use their nascent peace leadership skills in a way that was meaningful to them to impact their worlds. And finally, since I'm an advocate, as I said at the beginning, for peace and human rights education in every school, every kid's classroom worldwide, I would call on us all to remember that students can be our most powerful ally in advocating for change. Based on our experience, they intuitively understand, especially the more marginalized students, the need for this, not as an extracurricular, but as one of the central purposes and outcomes of education. Thank you.
Dr. Duckworth, that was awesome. I was really interested about the student-led projects too. I think that was really fascinating.
Oh, thanks.
We may have to do another webinar at some point based on the projects.
Just write me, we'll set it up.
Sounds good. Now, I know we do want to open it up to the audience questions. There is a Q&A section on the webinar, and as well as the chat, where we can open up some questions for Dr. Duckworth and our staff as well. Nicole, you want to field those questions as they come in?
Yes, I will gladly do so. We haven't received any questions yet, just some positive feedback in the chat about the subject matter. I thought it was fascinating. I have a quick question just to start us off. I'm sure you mentioned it, but can you break down, I guess, the age group again that you were working with when working with these students? Was it like high school? Was it certain years?
Yes, it was high school.
Mm-hmm.
It was high school.
Freshman to senior, anybody?
Yeah, freshman to senior. Not fewer seniors than freshmen, sophomore, and juniors, because seniors go and graduate on us, and we were hoping to really continue the program. But there were some seniors in the program. So yeah, high school. We were hoping to be able to then expand it, of course, to other schools and even to middle school as well. And someday I know that we'll be able to do that. Again, the demands on Broward County after this shooting, a lot of those resources went to safety and security mandates, things like that, and it just became very, very difficult to continue the way that we would have wanted to. But I know that opportunity will come again. And needless to say, right now schools are dealing with the pandemic that we're all dealing with. Half the students are virtual and things like this, but there will be another opportunity, I know, because the student interest was absolutely there. And the teacher, God bless him, the teacher interest and willingness to give even more of themselves was there as well. So thank you.
We have somebody that raised their hand, so I'm gonna allow them to talk.
Oh, great.
I think I can do that. Let's see.
I bet you can.
Yeah, hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Mazen.
Hey, Doctor, thank you so much. This was actually a really interesting presentation. I do think that it comes at a very important time, with the dynamics of the United States. This election, even shows that the country is polarized, and that's a dangerous combination in itself. The United States is still a very attractive nation for immigrants, whether, and that's including, the problems that immigrants have or not. And, with development, to sustain a peaceful society, even with the problems that we have today, you need a mechanism to kind of keep that intact. So a lot of the schools have thought, in universities and, that try to fill specific niches like, political science, international affairs. Mm-hmm. There's a disconnect between, the practice, the research, and the theory. So, a lot of students that go in, they kind of go into their own caves in a way, and that's where they stay. The theory kind of stays way up there.
Right.
So, this is really, it gives back to the community, and I think we do have a great development of a nation, and to sustain that in a positive way, you need to see some of that trickle down to the people. So I think it's really productive, especially for the U.S. And I think in case of the youth, when we do see cases of school shootings, stuff like that, that's a calling for peace education.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think your comments are just right on point. There's such a need there. And I guess I would go back just very quickly to what I said at the very beginning, which is we have to, I think, re-ask ourselves, what do we educate people for? And of course, everybody wants numeracy and literacy and all of those basics, and Lord knows I am in awe of medical research right now, which already has a vaccine on the way to us. All of those things are so incredibly necessary, but when we only treat education as something that is a form of just job training, I really think we lose. And students can't connect to it. They can't connect to it. They can't connect to each other because they see all of the issues that are going on. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make as adults is to think that we can hide these things from them. They see it. They see it, especially high schoolers. I think much younger children do too as well, but especially high schoolers.
Yeah, thank you.
So it isn't fooling them to try to shunt some of these issues out of the classroom. It just makes them feel alienated. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Actually, there's something else that you just reminded me of. Maybe there should be like a return to what education really is, because as education develops, the Greek term is medicine even considered, for example, a real form of education, and the fact that it teaches you about the world, or is it something that's specific? And
interesting.
Just a thought, but thank you so much, Doctor. I really appreciate that.
Oh, what an interesting question. Yeah, thank you.
We have a couple more, one from Dean Nevins. And she asked, in the aftermath of the race-related protests this summer, how could peace education have a role in our healing and recovery after a very violent situation?
What a terrific question, and a very, very timely question. And I think it's a question from Dean Nevins that almost underscores one of the arguments that I make from this data, which is the young people are out ahead of us in terms of curriculum in school and pedagogy. They already understand that we're not going to have peaceful schools or communities if we don't have more just and equitable peaceful school communities, if we don't have inclusion and equity. And many of them already see diversity as inherently educational and inherently valuable. So I think the first step is probably to understand they're out ahead of us. And I think if we come to understand that as school boards, state legislatures, a lot of people forget that's where the real power in terms of changing school is state legislatures, right, as well as local school boards. I think we need to take every opportunity possible. But education, and I'm preaching to the choir here with Dean Nevins, I know, but it's just one of those perennially underfunded sectors. Even colleges and universities, there's just been less and less and less investment, but certainly K through 12. We've talked about universal pre-K for since I can remember. I think since I entered education in the mid 90s. It is perennially underfunded in general. And as long as we have a testing regime and a regime of standards that prevents teachers from developing these kinds of creative programs, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to make a lot of progress. Right? And I'm going to be very blunt. I know this is recorded. Can I be blunt anyway? One of the things that we need to reckon with, and just to really have a hard look in the mirror about it, is what do we do when the adult is the bully? What do we do when the adult is the bully? Because I promise you the young people see that. Right? And so there needs to be accountability there, whether we're talking about school resource officers or teachers. I think this has to start with accountability. So I want us to see, I want us to do, pull every lever we can, right? From accountability, teaching young people about nonviolence, peer mediation skills, interdisciplinary curriculum, right? That would teach, for example, history and literature together, right? To help kids make those connections about what has driven conflicts in history and how things really change and how they can be a part of it. Right? These are all different levers that I want us to be pulling at the same time so that we can generate as much change as possible, as quickly as possible, because people can't wait anymore. So that question inspired me. Thank you.
We have a couple more questions from Dr. McKay now. And the first, it was, did your study data point to any significant differences between the ages of the students and their ideas about student-led projects?
Interesting. No, it didn't really point to that, although I should say we didn't ask that specific question. Right, so our data told us if somebody was in 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th grade, which there are considerable differences in, in development over those 4 years. A lot happens in those 4 years. But the data that we got from each of those 4 age groups was really quite similar, right? Relevance, engagement, an opportunity to be a part of change. So I didn't really see huge differences. That's a really interesting question. Thank you.
And then her next question was, well, first she said she appreciates the findings of the study, pointing to the importance of the value of smaller groups with long-term engagement. Do you think that smaller groups should intentionally begin in lower grades, such as elementary school, to help students better understand each other and value cultural differences in history.
I absolutely think that. I absolutely think that. One of the things that happened over the K through 12 curriculum, and I'm more familiar with middle and high school than elementary, but there is a certain amount of what you could call peace education kind of built into kindergarten, first grade, right? We learn about groups and sharing and being fair and things like this. And then it's almost as if we figure by second or third grade, you've got it. And, now we start the real learning, if you will, with, fractions and chapter books and, things like this. I would like to, and I've begun developing, this is sort of a life project, a K through 12 scope and sequence for peace education. And for folks who are not from the world of conflict resolution or ed, you might not know that phrase, scope and sequence. It's just a delineation, a breakdown of what kids would learn in each grade, right? So there's a scope and sequence for math, right? By fifth grade, we want to be doing long division, things like that. I would love to see us start out, just as Dr. McKay suggests, in that pre-K and kindergarten with some basic ideas, and then progressively get more sophisticated, all the way up through undergrads, right, who are facing a whole new world, right, when you make that transition to campus, right? You're going to be facing all new different kinds of conflicts and the wider world and conflicts in society, broadly speaking. I think we need to be very intentional and explicit about it, and we've got to treat it as one of the key purposes of education, right? Not that something that you can get to once you're done with what's on the test.
Awesome. Is that the last question, Nicole?
Yeah, it was so far. Thank you, everybody, for participating and asking your questions. And thank you, Dr. Duckworth, for sharing. This was very, very interesting.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.
The audience know too, Dr. Duckworth, we're going to record, we recorded already. I know Nicole had started that. So if anybody wants any follow-up or anything, I hope you don't mind if we share your email to the group.
No, not at all. Let's see. I've got that. Here we go. There we go.
Very nice. So there you go, audience. Well, we'll also follow up with you as well via email and share the presentation link and some of our great graduate programs and certificate programs. Obviously, our Peace Studies graduate certificate as well, and some of our master's and Ph.D. So, all right.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks
Stay
again.
safe out there.
Have a great night. Bye. I think there's still a few attendees still in there, but thanks again, Dr. Duckworth. I'm going to have to let you.
Thank you all.